I'm Martin L. Pall. I'm Professor Emeritus. I've been studying the mechanism of action of non-thermal effects of electromagnetic fields. And I discovered what that mechanism is. I have published 8 papers on it. The first paper has been cited now 223 times in the scientific literature. So it's been very widely recognized, this mechanism. And I've given 48 invited professional talks on this topic. So it's been very widely recognized in that way. The mechanism is extraordinarily sensitive to the electromagnetic fields. It's particularly sensitive to pulsations in the electromagnetic field. And pulsations are not considered in any of the safety guidelines, but are extraordinarily important. And particularly important for 5G, because 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed. It will therefore be extraordinarily dangerous.
We've had 17 studies on people living near cell phone towers. Every single one of them show effects on people living near cell phone towers, in most cases within 300 meters of a cell phone tower, so about 1,000 feet. And a very large fraction of the population lives within 300 meters of a cell phone tower. And the latest review that was published on this stated, and I think this is a direct quote, that there is a remarkable increase in cancer in people living within 400 meters of a cell phone tower. Now, when you see that kind of stuff, and you see this absolute consistency in these data, it's ludicrous to say that nothing's going on here. It's obvious things are going on. The question is, why is it that not a single one of these studies has been done in the US? Why is it that not a single one of these studies have been done in Canada? Why is it that none of these studies have been done in the UK? You know, the English-speaking world is nowhere in this. I say that with great regret. You know, while those same governments are very actively encouraging the putting out of hundreds of thousands of cell phone towers that are inevitably impacting the health of a large fraction of the people in the country, they are doing absolutely nothing to protect our health. Absolutely nothing. In fact, it's just quite the contrary. They're hiding this evidence from the people.
So what are the effects that are produced by these EMFs? And they're produced at levels of exposure far, far below Safety Code 6 or any of the other safety guidelines that are out there from ICNRP, from the EU, from the US-FCC, etc. They include neurological and neuropsychiatric effects of the sort that are already very far along in our societies. Can't sleep, I'm tired all the time, I'm depressed, my memory doesn't work, I've got headaches, anxiety, etc., etc. All these things that are highly common, we know are caused by EMFs far below the levels of the safety guidelines and are already far advanced in our societies. Same thing is true of reproductive effects. We have reproductive effects of several sorts in males and in females. We have increased spontaneous abortion, decreased levels of each of the 3 types of sex hormones, decreased libido. All those things are going on at levels well below safety guidelines. This is already highly advanced in our society. In 2017, it was shown that sperm counts have dropped to below 50% of normal in every single technologically advanced country on Earth. We're expecting that reproduction will crash to 0 based on some animal studies. I don't have time to talk about them. And probably in short order. And we're starting to see evidence for that in 3 of the small East Asian countries now. There are other things. There are hormonal effects. There are effects on the DNA of our cells, which in turn produce mutations. And there are many, many other effects. There are life-threatening cardiac effects that are highly, again, advanced in our societies. So we're in incredible trouble. And yeah, that's exactly right. We are in incredible trouble. And, you know, and the only solution really is the one that Dr. Shaley is going to talk about, and that is to use wired communication rather than wireless. And so, you know, we really need to stay away from wireless communication to the extent that we can. And where we have it, we need to keep it away from populated areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so every cell in our body has a membrane around it. It's called a plasma membrane. And in that membrane are some proteins that are called channels. And what the EMFs do is they activate certain channels. They're called voltage-gated calcium channels. And when they open up, you get huge amounts of calcium flowing into the cell. And normally inside the cell, calcium levels are very low. They're about 1/10,000th of the concentration outside the cell. So when you open these things up, you get huge amounts of calcium flowing in, and you know, and it should be obvious that our cells keep calcium levels very low for good reason. They spend a lot of time and energy keeping calcium out or pumping it out, and so this causes all kinds of havoc when you get excessive calcium in the cell. And we know how it causes havoc, and we know how it can produce all these different effects, depending on what kind of cell, what part of the body is being impacted. The latest review on you know, the cell phone tower health effects states, and I believe this is word for word, that people living within 400 meters, and they called them mobile phone base stations, but anyway, have a remarkable increase in cancer within 400 meters. We've got over half the population living within 400 meters of a cell phone tower. Okay. I mean, you know, this is the kind of insanity we have, and for whatever reason, you know, governments around the world are hiding this information at the same time that they are pushing this technology out hand over fist. You know, this is one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about these so-called small cells, where everybody's going to be within, you know, within something like 100 meters of one of these things, and these things are, you know, predicted to be extraordinarily active because of the extraordinary levels of pulsations they'll have. And, you know, when you compare them with the other cell phone towers, which we already know are very dangerous, but are probably nowhere near as dangerous as these small cells are going to be, you know, it's just totally insane to do this kind of thing. I mean, it's something that's almost beyond belief. But each of these things, you know, they put them out with claims of safety that are worthless. And then when the evidence is clear that there are substantial health effects, they just ignore them. You know, and you even get statements from regulatory agencies saying, "Oh, there's no evidence of effects," which is, you know, absolute, complete falsehood. You know, how we can be living in a world like that is hard to imagine. When you look at the studies on genuine Wi-Fi radiation, and the reason I say genuine is because the real exposures that we have are very highly pulsed. There are a lot of studies out there that claim to be about cell phone radiation or Wi-Fi radiation that are not. They're on something that's the same frequency but either doesn't pulse at all or pulses much less. And we know the pulsations are very important. So these things are basically fraudulent studies because of what they're studying and what they claim they're studying. They claim they're studying cell phone radiation when they're not, or they claim they're studying Wi-Fi radiation when they're not. And when you look at the real things, you find, yeah, you know, they produce effects. When you look at this, you know, what we call simulated cell phone radiation or simulated Wi-Fi radiation, the majority of them don't show effects. So now that may be for other reasons in addition to, what they're looking at, but the point is that, it is not hard to set up experiments to fail. It's very easy to do that. Okay, so we've talked about 3 fatal flaws in the safety guidelines, right? We talked about all these different effects that occur well below safety guidelines. We talked about the fact that pulsations are very important in determining the effects, but they're not considered in the safety guidelines. And we talked about this VGCC mechanism, which is extraordinarily sensitive to these EMF effects. It turns out that there are 5 others that are types of evidence, each of which show the safety guidelines do not predict biological effects and therefore do not predict safety. One is that there are a whole series of studies that have been done on nanosecond pulses. These are pulses that are defined as something between 1 nanosecond, that's 1/1000th of a second, and 1 microsecond, which is 1/1,000,000th of a second. And so, these things are occurring extremely rapidly. You just have a very short pulse and you get effects over and over and over again. But when you average these over 6 minutes, the intensity is so low that the industry says, oh, can't possibly do anything. Health Canada says, oh, it can't possibly do anything, but it does. So take a typical example. Let's take a typical 40 nanosecond pulse. So it only needs a short pulse for 40 nanoseconds and it produces effects. And if you average it over 6 minutes, that's about 10 billion times longer. All right? 10 to the 10th times longer. And when you average it over 10 to the 10th times longer, of course, that decreases the average intensity by a factor of 10 to the 10th, 10 billion, right? And so what does industry say? Or what does ICNRP say? Or what does Health Canada say? There can't possibly be any effects because the average intensity is too low. So average intensities over 6 minutes make absolutely no sense in something that will produce an effect in 40 nanoseconds, 1/10 billionth at a time. Make absolutely no sense. But that's what they're doing. Okay? I've got an example of a similar sort of false logic. Let's say I'm afraid I'm going to be shot by a high-powered rifle bullet that goes over 700 meters a second. That takes about 50 microseconds to tear your body apart. You go to a regulatory agency and they say, oh, you don't have to worry about that. If you average it over 10 billion times longer, which in this case would be 75 days, the force on your body is so weak it can't possibly do anything. So don't worry about it, you're perfectly safe. That is the kind of logic that is being used by ICNRP, the US-FCC, the EU, Health Canada, etc. That is that kind of logic. Now, if somebody told you that about a rifle bullet, what would you say? You'd say, oh, they're either completely incompetent or completely corrupt or both, right? Exactly the same thing applies in this case. Well, about 25 years ago, Dr. Henry Lai and his colleagues showed that much of the longer-term neurological effects of EMFs went through the action of dynorphin, which is an endogenous opiate that's produced in the brain, and through the stimulation of the opiate receptors in the brain. So that showed immediately, substantial evidence that EMFs can produce an addictive-like response. What I've been interested in are a lot of the more recent studies which have shown, and we know that the EMFs act mainly through activation of voltage-gated calcium channels. And what's interesting is all of the addictive drugs also work through the activation of voltage-gated calcium channels. The whole addiction process is produced in that way. And that's true whether you're talking about opiate drugs, or you're talking about cocaine, or amphetamines, or nicotine. They all work through the action of the two of the voltage-gated calcium channels, and so they work just like The EMFs do. So we have every reason to think that the EMFs are just as addictive as these drugs. And what's important here is that this addictive process, and this was shown by Henry Lai 25 years ago, and it's also true with the addictive drugs, that whole process can be learned by classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is the kind of stuff with Pavlov's dogs that I think all of us know about. If you pair this addictive response with exposure to a particular device, you can become physiologically addicted to that device. That means because your cell phones put out EMFs, you can become physiologically addicted to them. Because Wi-Fi put out EMFs, you can become physiologically addicted to Wi-Fi. You can become physiologically addicted to all these things. And you may even become physiologically addicted to certain sites that you access on Wi-Fi. You know, you like to watch porn videos on Wi-Fi, you could become addicted to those. If you like political sites with a particular orientation, you could get addicted to those. So there's a lot of potential here for all kinds of havoc being produced by the addictive nature of these EMFs and this whole issue of classical conditioning. So, you know, this is something that in and of itself is something that can easily be of just incredible importance to our societies and the changes that we've seen in our societies in recent years. You know, when you give babies these cell phones to play with as toys, and you try to take it away from them, they go into, you know, they scream and they cry, and, you know, I mean, these young babies are being destroyed by what we're doing to them. It's absolutely horrendous what's going on. You know, obviously children have, you know, higher surface to volume ratios, they have thinner skulls, so things penetrate. But, you know, they also penetrate in adults. And so, but there are other reasons why children are more sensitive. Specifically, the developing nervous system is much more sensitive to the EMFs, and children have much higher densities of stem cells, and stem cells are very, very sensitive to the EMFs. So that makes children more sensitive as well. So there's a lot of reasons. It's not just one. We have 4 reasons to think that EMFs are much more dangerous for young children than for adults. And in general, the younger they are, the more sensitive they are. So those are special issues, and those four things are basically, first of all, that children have higher surface to volume ratios and they have thinner skulls, so their brains are much more exposed. Secondly, that we know that children have much higher densities of stem cells, and the younger they are, the higher the densities. Stem cells, it turns out, are highly sensitive to EMFs, and that's been shown by Dr. Belyaev and his colleagues in many, many studies, and also by others. So that's a second reason. A third reason is that the developing nervous system, I think, is highly sensitive to the EMFs, and the fourth reason is that, and this is something that Dr. Deborah Davis has discussed, is that the tissues in young children have much more extracellular water content, and that allows for much more penetration of the effects into the tissues in children. So for all of those reasons, children are more susceptible, and so there's special reasons to avoid Wi-Fi in schools. And Wi-Fi has, you know, lots of effects on adults, so that's by no means benign for us as well. So yeah, I don't know why we're using Wi-Fi for anything. I mean, it makes no sense. You can do everything wired. It works a lot better. It's a lot more secure. And yeah, it's a little less convenient, but you know, losing your brain function and the DNA of your cells and stuff and other things. That's not very convenient either. There were known non-thermal effects already back in the 1950s and 1960s, and the claim that that they don't occur is just a complete and utter fiction. It is simply false, and it's been known to be false for decades. We know that there are major impacts on our brains, producing neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. We know there are major impacts on our reproductive systems that have major effects on our reproductive capacities. We know that there are impacts on the DNA and the cells of our bodies. We know that essentially every hormone system in the body is impacted. We know that there are high levels of oxidative stress, which have roles in essentially every chronic disease you can name. We know that there are elevated levels of what's called apoptosis, programmed cell death, which have important roles in causing neurodegenerative diseases and the reproductive effects. You know, it just goes on and on and on. They could not show the way they did their experiments that the EHS people were reacting to EMFs. And so they interpreted it as a nocebo effect. The problem with this is there's a lot of ways to screw up your experiments. And so a negative result doesn't necessarily tell you that nothing's going on. It just tells you under the conditions that were used that they couldn't see anything. And But there have been experiments done that show the opposite, and the first of those was published by Dr. Bill Ray and his colleagues about 26 years ago now, that showed that you could show that a substantial fraction of the EHS people could be, do react using objective measures to EMFs where they didn't know whether the EMF was on or off, or whether it was on or off, but they did in fact react when it was on and not when it was off. There have been similar studies. Magda Havas published 2 studies of a similar sort, not using identical methodology, but similar methodologies. And then there was another one that was published by McCarthy et al. That showed somewhat similar effects as well. So each of those shows that there are real, genuine EHS people who are reacting under controlled conditions where they don't know when they're exposed. They're reacting to the exposures in a reproducible fashion, so that is clearly not a nocebo effect. There are also physiological changes that occur in the EHS people, particularly they have oxidative stress responses. And there are also genetic studies which show that there's real biology going on here. So again, that shows, again, it's not a nocebo effect. And finally, I think, and most importantly, the studies of Heuser and Heuser showed that there were specific neural circuits in the brain that were activated by EMF exposures. So I think the whole nocebo effect just simply isn't true. But the industry loves to make that argument. Things that are occurring are, I can't sleep, I'm tired all the time, I'm depressed, my memory doesn't work, I've got headaches, I'm anxious, all the things that people, all the things that people complain about now, all the time, we know are caused by EMS and by multiple types of EMFs, and those are all effects that tend to be cumulative over time. When you study what's going on in animals, what you find is there are direct impacts on animal brains, so that the structure of the brains become more and more aberrant with time of exposures. 2 exposures well within our safety guidelines that should be doing absolutely nothing if the exposure guidelines had any reality to them, but they don't. So, you know, that's one of the things that's going on that's already highly advanced in our societies. We have reproductive effects, where you get lowered sperm count, lowered sperm quality, lowered sperm motility. You get changes in the structure of the testis. You get changes in the structure of the ovaries. You get lowered number of eggs. That's been studied in animals. You get increased spontaneous abortion. You get lowered levels of each of the 3 types of sex hormones, and you get lowered libido. That combination's pretty potent. We have now, today, the knowledge that sperm counts in every single technologically advanced country on Earth have dropped to below 50% of normal. Now, how can we pretend that nothing is going on? It's complete and utter nonsense. We have 17 studies on people living near cell phone towers. Every single one of them show effects in people typically living within 300 meters of a cell phone tower. We have 23 studies on Wi-Fi. Every single one of those things show effects. We have, the Panagopoulos and his colleagues reviewed 48 studies on genuine cell phone radiation. 46 of them showed effects. How can, and so these are all effects on things that, you know, we are being exposed to every day, all the time. It's complete and utter nonsense to say that nothing's going on. This is probably one of the biggest lies that's ever been made.
Oh, dude, we're in bad shape.
Hundreds of millions of people will become irreversibly and severely affected by these EMFs. And it's inevitable because many of these effects are cumulative, and as they become more severe, they become irreversible. So this kind of nonsense has to stop. It's extraordinarily damaging, it's extraordinarily dangerous, and it's all based on propaganda that's put out by the companies, and it's complete nonsense.